Welcome to this online event organized by the Institute for Policy Reforms. It's one more episode in our series of discussing policy issues of critical importance to the country and the region. Today we will discuss the future of South Asia, stalemate, cooperation or war. My name is Ashraf Hayat. I'm Executive Director here. Well, deep thanks to all of you for joining, and especially the speakers, Mr. Tariq Aziz, Dr. Anatol Lieven, Dr. Daniel Markey, Dr. Goze Teng, and Mr. Akar Patel. You honor us with your time, gentlemen. We start with a short recitation from the Holy Quran. Mr. Irtaqa Zaidi is one of the participants, and I request him to recite a selection. Zaidi sir?
Assalamu alaikum. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بأصحاب الفيل ألم يجعل كيدهم في تضليل وأرسل عليهم طيرا أبابيل ترميهم بحجارة من سجيل فجعلهم كعصف مأكول صدق الله العزيز.
Shukriya Zaidi sir. Once again, welcome. The subject of today's discussion is one that acutely affects the people of this region. National security is connected with the country's economy and politics, and of course the reverse is also true. We will begin with introductory comments from Mr. Humayun Akhtar Khan. Humayun Saab has been in public service for decades. Mr. Khan is CEO and chairperson of this institute, the Institute for Policy Reforms, and very much a source of inspiration for those who work here. In the context of today's discussion, it is apt to recall that as Pakistan's Commerce Minister in 2002 through 2007, he led and successfully concluded the SAFTA, South Asia Free Trade Agreement. I request Humayun Saab for his welcome comments and for introducing today's topic.
Thank you, Ashraf Saab, and hello everyone, and thank you for joining us at this online discussion on the future of South Asia. My special thanks to the speakers for sparing their time. We are greatly honored. Three perspectives affect the future of our region, and I hope today's discussion will help us better understand them. The first is an increased realization that we live in a fragile world. Such a world needs friction. Such a world needs less friction and more cooperation. The second is the enduring and evolving issues that have confounded relations between Pakistan and India. Unresolved issues between them have held back integration of South Asia as a whole. Third is the ever-widening differences between China and the United States, and the likelihood of a world divided into two blocks. 30 years of engagement between the West and China brought prosperity for all, but this may be about to change. We must understand how this will affect our region. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it is an awareness about the limits and inadequacy of the tools that we employ to govern. The size of our economy or the arsenal of weapons have not helped against a foe that we cannot even see. The virus has increased awareness about the fragility of the world in which we live. And we have also seen that instability in one country will affect others. With respect to South Asia, our bilateral relations with India have been in a stalemate. We must take stock of the implications of continued friction. By 2050, Pakistan will have a population of over 400 million, and India's population will be over 1.6 billion. This growth can be a windfall for our economies, or it could bring about a crisis. It will be a boon if a skilled and educated workforce of young people fuel the wheels of our industries. And if this does not happen, it will be a crisis. And at present, a crisis is the more likely outcome. Lastly, I turn to the risks that an increasingly polarized world may bring. It affects everyone, and not just the main players. Recently, China has been described in the West as a revisionist state and a strategic competitor, ready to upend the world order. Decades of engagement between the West and China has brought affluence and stability for all. Decoupling of economies and breakup into military and economic blocs with technologies that cannot connect with each other will be a loss for the whole world. One outcome of this division of the world in blocs can be seen in South Asia. India had always guarded its strategic autonomy. It is now considering entering into military alliances. Of course, that is a decision that India has to take. However, regardless of the intra-region differences, Pakistan does not want to see South Asia divided into hardened alliances. I leave the last bit of observation for Pakistan. We must also review our own mistakes and the narrow definition with which we have pursued foreign policy interests. We must view our governance paradigm and the political economy of dependence and lack of resources, because how we govern at home has a bearing on our ability to pursue regional interests. Now, these are complex issues, and we could not have a better set of experts to help us navigate them. This online event is the beginning of a dialogue, not its end. Yet I'm sure that we will leave the meeting much better informed. I hope also that policymakers will take cue from this discussion. I thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a good overview of our topic, and those few minutes packed a whole agenda of things to do and that may require a rethink of our goals and policies. We now move to our main speakers, and it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Anatol Lieven, who of course needs no introduction. Professor Lieven's book, Pakistan, a Hard Country, was widely praised in Pakistan and internationally. Currently, he's professor at Georgetown University's Qatar campus and visiting professor at King's College London. He's also senior fellow at New America Foundation in Washington, D.C. Earlier, Dr. Lieven was a journalist for the Financial Times and the Times London. He covered instability in Afghanistan from the frontiers, so to speak. As a leading expert on our region, there are many claimants on Dr. Lieven's time, and I'm thankful that he's with us today. So Anatol, on the one hand, the issues between Pakistan and India have been intractable. On the other, there are evolving developments and considerations, some of which that Humayun Sahib just alluded to, that may have a bearing on how things and events unfold. Do you see the region become more divided, or is there a possibility that our countries could agree to resolve differences and cooperate? The floor is yours, Anatol.
Thank you so much, Ashraf, and it's really nice to be back with you again. was always delighted to speak at this institute. I'm only sorry I can't be with you in person for obvious reasons. I was going to end actually with what Humayun Khan said at the end of his remarks, which is that, of course, ultimately the well-being, even God forbid, the survival of Pakistan in the long run will depend on internal reform in Pakistan and the well-being of Pakistan's domestic system and society, because without that, no geopolitical success can help Pakistan. Now, as far as this region is concerned, I'm afraid I do not see many opportunities for regional reconciliation. the divisions between India and Pakistan are too deep, and of course, alas, are being in many ways deepened still further by the wider geopolitical rivalry between the USA and China. This is, in my view, also very unlikely to change as a result of the US presidential elections. Biden is just as hostile to China as Trump on trade policy and other matters. The growing American closeness to India was initiated and followed under democratic administrations. And of course, US policy will become, under a Biden administration, more coherent, and it will be easier for the US to find allies outside South Asia. But I don't think the basic line of US policy will change. One area where, of course, there is room for considerable change is Afghanistan. Once again, that's not because US policy will change. Biden opposed President Obama's military surge in Afghanistan. He has always had, but for a long time, deep skepticism about the Afghan operation. I wouldn't expect him precipitately to withdraw all US troops from Afghanistan, but I certainly wouldn't expect him to reinforce them. And the peace process in Afghanistan will continue, but will be determined by internal Afghan factors. There isn't really time to go into these in detail now, but I, alas, am not optimistic about that turning out well. However, I do not think that this needs to create more hostility between Pakistan and the USA necessarily. After all, Pakistan's position has been really the same for ages now, which is that it supports peace, but will not put itself in the position of trying to force the Taliban into a settlement which most of them oppose. That seems to me a reasonable position, and one that will not change the basic dynamics of the situation. If, of course, the Taliban seems to be moving towards complete victory, that would throw things into the air in an interesting fashion. But even then, perhaps, it is more likely that the US would seek accommodation that would allow it to withdraw with its vital interests secure, rather than trying to stop a Taliban victory. We'll have to see. Perhaps the biggest impact of the US elections, but on this I defer to Dr. Markey, who is in the USA, after all, I'm not, but will be the elections themselves. If, as we must all hope, there is a clear result, and I hope, obviously, for a clear Biden victory, and the constitutional order is maintained, then one will see, after a steep drop under Trump, a certain, rebuilding of American soft power and prestige in the world. If, God forbid, the results are disputed and there is a massive constitutional crisis accompanied by mass violence on the streets, possibly in part along racial lines, then obviously the prestige of American democracy will suffer a very bad blow. And almost automatically the prestige of the Chinese model will go up, and China's own very grave faults in Xinjiang and Hong Kong will be, to that degree, erased in the eyes of the world. So that's on the US elections. Concerning Pakistan, India, I can see no room for serious movement. Certainly not under the administration of the BJP and Narendra Modi. I mean, everything has gone in the opposite direction on Kashmir. The question is rather, could things get very much worse? And here, as we've seen in recent months, the most critical new or partly new dynamic is that between China and India, which obviously has the potential to escalate into something truly disastrous. Now, I'm not as worried about this as some observers. If you look at the aftermath of the latest clash, despite the heaviest Indian casualties for many years and an unknown but possibly heavy number of Chinese casualties as well, the Indians moved very quickly to try to de-escalate, and the Chinese did not try to push their advantage. And it seems to me that the underlying dynamic of this relationship is in the Himalayas is as follows. The Indian military analysts know that if there is a full-scale war between India and China, the Chinese will win, as things stand today. And the Indians can have no confidence that the United States could or indeed would rescue them in those circumstances. The United States would no doubt make very strong noises of support, maybe economic sanctions. But if you look at what happened to Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014, you'd have to be pretty hopeful to think that you will get the United States engaging in a war on behalf of India. And so, up to now, the Indians have not pursued approaches so provocative as to drive the Chinese towards a really massive escalation. On the Chinese side, unless they see some massive provocation from the Indian side, for example, a much deeper Indian engagement in the South China Sea, I don't think that the Chinese think that they can get any significant gains from a war with India, at least no gains nearly significant enough to outweigh the diplomatic and economic damage. The Indians don't want more territory. Sorry, the Chinese don't want more territory from the Indians. If they did, they could have taken it years ago. And they have no particular need for another crisis. But there are possibilities for miscalculation. I've just seen yet another Indian discussion pushed by Indian hawks, the Indian lobby in America, the Indian Navy, precisely for a greater Indian engagement in the South China Sea. And if the Indians come in on the American side in the South China Sea, I think Beijing will try to teach them a pretty sharp lesson. And of course, that can escalate dangerously. But I don't think that this points inexorably towards conflict. I think this can be managed at the present level. I certainly hope so. On Pakistan's position in all this, I think that it is very clear that China does have a real commitment to Pakistan, and would undoubtedly try to save Pakistan if India threatened, to destroy or really seriously to damage Pakistan. But it is very clear from history that the Chinese will not back Pakistan in a greatly intensified, shall we say, approach to the Kashmir dispute. And the Chinese are deeply hostile to the idea of being pulled into a conflict with India, which they do not control, above all, of course, by Islamist extremist forces. So I think Pakistan should continue what to a great extent has been its policy in recent years, which is one of caution over that issue, despite, of course, some very provocative subject. I believe Pakistan stands to gain nothing and lose an enormous amount by an escalation of this conflict. And just to finish on the point that I began, the real of Pakistan from the existing situation is this closeness to China. Pakistan is China's closest partner. And what ought to be the economic result of this, which is in a very advantageous position to take over some of the industries that will move out of China as Chinese wages and costs go up. There are, of course, a lot of competitors for that in the world, both in Asia and in Africa, but Pakistan should be the best placed. As yet, I see, alas, few signs of that, but that will depend, above all, on what Pakistan does at home. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatol. That was just such a professional, such a complete and comprehensive review of our region, the Greater South Asia and China region. Thank you. And what it probably indicates is that for Pakistan, of course, domestic, look at the domestic policies, but overall, the leadership of the region has to show grit and we're fortunate also to have Mr. Tariq Aziz, former National Security Advisor. Over 10 years ago in the mid-2000s, Mr. Aziz was the lead negotiator for the quiet diplomacy that took place between Pakistan and India, and which almost led to an agreement for the signing. That agreement could conceivably have put behind us years of discord. Of course, much has happened since those promising days. I request Tariq Aziz Saab to draw on that experience and help us understand if in today's context, it is at all likely that the two countries will refocus and re-engage to give talks and negotiations a chance. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. I feel so happy to be amongst this August gathering, trying to find solutions to have tranquility all in the world. When I started negotiation with the Indian counterparts, starting with Mr. Mishra, the then National Security Advisor, started in London. Then Mr. Mishra had to go after Congress came to power. Then it was Mr. and then Mr. Lamba. I think that it is very, very crucial that the government, let's say we are talking of now two governments, Pakistan and India. They are sincere in resolving the disputed issues. And we achieved a great success when Mr. Vajpayee came to SAC conference 2006 or 4, and an agreement was signed that India admitted for the first time after 1949 that Kashmir was a disputed territory. On the other hand, Pakistan promised that we will try our best to stop infiltration. I must say that we had reached a written agreement, but unfortunately events happened in Pakistan whereby we had to stop further negotiation on this. We had just to cross T and dot the I's when the judicial crisis took place. After General Musharraf left Pakistan, I had gone to England and Richard Boucher, I think they were Under Secretary of State, he found out where I was staying and he was very kind to take me for lunch and asked for this as to how to achieve peace in the subcontinent, in Afghanistan and in Southeast Asia. This is my conviction that in Southeast Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, and the subcontinent, they are basically, or they should be concerned about this peace and development and poverty alleviation, for which we need total sincerity and have faith in this. That if we can achieve this, it will be good for the subcontinent plus India plus Afghanistan and Iran. And I proposed that I think we should have a regional council in which all these countries I have named should be partners, and this regional council should have the blessing of the superpowers, especially USA, China, Russia, UK, because of historical involvement in this area. No peace can be reached. And we should try to forget about the mutual clash of mutual interests and try to resolve it mutually between the two countries and not disturb if any peace process is going wrong anywhere. In fact, they should encourage this, and it is for their interest. I do not think that USA or China or Russia, they want a war. If they do not, they have to reach some kind of consensus, which is badly needed between India and Pakistan also. Afghanistan is very crucial for this because Iran, China, Russia, Pakistan, and historically India, they have deep connections with Afghanistan. So I am very optimistic that whether it is a Republican government or a Democratic government, they will ultimately go for peace. And unless they decide to do so, the three superpowers matter most, USA, China, and Russia, then the entire world will be in a crisis. After the Second World War and after the 9/11 incident, people talked of a global village. in a village, there has to be justice and peace. Then all these superpowers should ensure that there is a justice in the world. Unless there is justice, there can be no peace in the world. Unless there's justice, there can be no peace in the village. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Aziz Saab, your personal story was extremely interesting and illuminating, and a good idea of how we can move forward from here. Our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Markey. He's Senior Research Professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. He was also Director of the Global Policy Program. He was Senior Fellow for South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, and before that, he held the South Asia portfolio on the US Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff at the Department of State. His book, No Exit from Pakistan, reviews the ups and downs of Pakistan-US relations. And his more recent work, China's Western Horizon, very well received, reviews the evolving political, economic, and security links between China and its neighbors. There are few experts who have studied our region more than Dr. Markey has, or who can explain to us better, untangle for us the complexity of issues here. So while you do so, Daniel, may I request you to also discuss in broad terms US interests in the region and how, if at all, it may change with the new administration, if there is one, of course. You have the virtual floor, Dr. Markey. Thank you.
Great, thank you. It is such a pleasure to be able to see a number of old friends and colleagues. And so thanks to the organizers for bringing me into this conversation. I believe Anatol said earlier that I bring a DC view, and that's true, but in this virtual world, I'm not really all that much closer to Washington, D.C. than any of you. I haven't been to my office in DuPont Circle since, well, except to pick up some books, since March. So I'm feeling a bit disconnected from the D.C. that I normally inhabit. It's a very strange world here, as it is in many other places. That said, of course, I continue to have conversations with friends and colleagues here in the DC circuit. And I guess I'll keep my remarks brief, but I would make three broad points. The first of these, and these are all related to the question of how, if at all, the outcome of the American election in November might affect our policies in South Asia. The first two of my points really relate to continuity that I perceive to be likely between the Trump administration and a potential Biden administration, or Trump and Trump 2. And the third is where I would see some differences. But the first point is, I think most of us have come to appreciate this, but it bears saying that the post 9/11 era is over. We are in a different world now. And I'll explain that a bit more. The second is that the US-China competition is the defining feature of the international order, and this has come to be appreciated certainly here in Washington, D.C. more than ever before. And third, directly related to the election, that the Biden or Trump outcome will determine the character of US world leadership, certainly for the next 4 years after the election, but perhaps for a very much longer period than that. And so this is an enormously consequential election in my view. Now, on this first point about the post 9/11 era being over, no matter who wins, Biden or Trump, the United States is clearly committed to reducing its military presence in Afghanistan. As Anatol pointed out, Vice President Biden campaigned, in a sense, within the Obama administration for a light footprint approach to Afghanistan. for and against a heavier military commitment. And there's nothing about his rhetoric on the campaign trail or anything that's been said by any of his surrogates that should lead us to believe that it would not be true to his word. He seeks a reduced American presence. If the Trump administration can be taken at its word, around the time of the election, we should have under 5,000 U.S. Troops in Afghanistan. And the Biden campaign has said that it would plan to have all U.S. combat troops out of Afghanistan within the first year that he would be in the presidency. Now, in so many ways, this is a part of a longer trend that predates President Trump, right? This was happening during the Obama administration, a shift away from counterterrorism as being the defining feature of the American agenda in the world, and a shift away from it as the top priority for the U.S. defense community or intelligence community. And this is a consequence in part of success in a narrow sense, because Al-Qaeda is no longer the threat that it once was. One can debate whether that success was achieved at too high a cost, but the reality is it is less a threat to the United States today than it was before 9/11. U.S. defenses, including homeland security defenses and intelligence capabilities to deal with terrorism as a real threat, have massively expanded over the years, perhaps too massively, but to the point that these are no longer quite the threats that they once were. And even organizations like ISIS have been dealt significant blows over the years in ways that have kept them from being, I think most of us here in the United States, kept them believe that they are no longer the type of threat that they once were. So it's partly a consequence of success, of shifting away from global war on terror or counterterrorism as our agenda or our principal agenda. But it's also a consequence of a reduced emphasis and ambition in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. Now, the interests of the United States have shifted over time. Again, not a short-term story, but a long-term story, in part because of our consumption or reduced consumption of imported oil from the region. So our interests have shifted. But also our ambition. Think back to the Bush administration's so-called freedom agenda, or even hopes and aspirations for the Arab Spring that came later. There are hardly any strategists, much less policymakers in Washington, who entertain such grand ambitions for the extension of democracy and a liberal world order throughout that region as many once did. And Biden is no Trump in this respect. He is a more idealistic than Trump and more of a defender of democratic principles and practices. But remember that even Obama had pulled back from this democratizing impulse of the United States and had shrunk the American ambition and had retreated to what was typically termed a more realist approach to the world and especially to the Middle East. So it's partly a reduced interest and ambition for the region. But the third thing is, of course, a political aspect here. There is simply an exhaustion in the United States from now 2 decades or so of this counterterrorism agenda and related wars, and partly a refocusing on matters closer to home that have already come up in our conversation here today. Of course, the pandemic and the economic collapse that's wrought here in the United States, which is hard to overstate. This is simply horrific, and the consequences will be with us probably for a generation. Also, the social unrest, which is partly the consequence of that and partly the consequence of other underlying realities of American society. And we will partly, I think, be consumed with the problem of defending our own democratic practices here at home, especially if, as Anatole pointed out, that this prospect of a contested electoral outcome which is increasingly believed by people who follow this more closely than I to be a legitimate concern and something that we ought to be worried about, that if we were viewing the world from an objective outside perspective of comparative political analysis, we would see many, many warning signs about the potential for this election, not just to be messy in the counting of votes, but to be messy in the way that it unfolds after those votes are counted. Okay, so for all of those reasons, the post 9/11 period is over. Now we're in a new era of U.S.-China competition. This, again, Anatol is right. The competition between Biden and Trump for being the toughest anti-China hawk is ongoing. Both sides are using pretty tough rhetoric about China and trying to demonstrate their credentials as being tougher on China than the other guy. Now, part of that is, I have to say, a bit overblown. Both candidates have had actually a mixed record and still have mixed aims when it comes to China. And that's because of the underlying reality that I think we're going to have to also deal with here in the United States, is that no matter how much decoupling may unfold between the US and the Chinese economies in coming years, we are still mutually entangled in a global economy, which is quite different from anything we really saw throughout the period of the previous Cold War. And that will persist. And so balancing the competition, even conflict with China, against the potential for mutual economic destruction that would be wrought from if that competition and conflict exceeds certain bounds is going to be a core feature of this mutual competition. So some of this rhetoric is a bit overblown. But the aspects of a tougher line on China are real. There is a bipartisan consensus here in the United States that China is the problem, and no matter who wins in November, the United States will be focused on that. And what this means is that as American policymakers look out onto the world, they will be remapping their sense of how the world works. And principally, in many instances where this was not previously the case, we'll be asking, what is China doing? What does China want? How does that intersect with what we are doing and what we want? And how does that affect the overall global competition that we're engaging with in China? In far-flung places from Latin America to Africa, and certainly to South Asia, this will be true, and this will change defense planning. It will change, has already changed the way that we think about technological competition in areas of telecommunications and infrastructure. It changes how we respond to Chinese initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, or even narrower activities like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And it will change the way that we respond to real and potential partners and allies, including India. Now, as Trump has attempted to shift, and this is the third point, Trump is different from Biden, and Biden is very different from Trump. As Trump has tried to shift the United States away from our traditional alliances, has denigrated relations with NATO and with institutions like the United States, the World Health Organization, and many of his most contentious relations have been with traditional American friends like Germany. Biden is going to clearly reverse course on all of these tracks and attempt to rekindle and rebuild those ties, placing old and traditional allies, especially Western European allies and the Japanese, at the center of American policy, and likely redoubling investment in U.S. leadership in multilateral settings, whether it's the United Nations or elsewhere. And this is a fundamental and important shift. And that commitment to American leadership, to American presence in these settings is something which would set him apart from the track that Trump has been on, and I think would have long-term implications. Now, let me just conclude with how this maps out for South Asia, because of course that's what our audience today is most concerned about. So the first business is the United States will be out of Afghanistan sooner rather than later. We've been saying this for many, many, many years, but it is actually coming true, and I think it doesn't matter who wins in the election. The threat of global terrorism will persist, but the United States will take a fundamentally different posture to deal with it. And one narrow question for Pakistan is where Pakistan may or may not be in that continued American counterterror effort, and in particular, whether Pakistan-US relations will benefit from a closer partnership on counterterror, including with respect to Afghanistan as we go forward, or whether that partnership will continue to be on somewhat rockier ground. Second point with respect to US concerns about China, as I think has already been made clear, the US-China competition is playing out in South Asia in potentially dangerous ways, not terribly constructive ways, and whereas in the past the United States and China were at least more unified in our approach to dealing with a potential crisis and crisis management between India and Pakistan. Now there too, I think the fraying US-China relationship makes crisis management much harder. And then the last point I will make is that because I think the US policies under a Biden administration would lean toward pressing issues like human rights, liberal order. One of the first things that the Biden campaign has said it wants to do is convene a global summit for democracy. We can anticipate that these types of issues will be higher priorities in South Asia as well. And the question is where India and Pakistan will stack up on these issues, because while India, for instance, will be seen as a strategic partner of the United States in countering China, the policies under Narendra Modi in Kashmir and throughout India on human rights, on democracy, backsliding in all of these areas will be a headache in that relationship for a Biden administration, something that needs to be managed and managed carefully and balanced against broader strategic concerns, as compared to a Trump administration, which I think would simply continue to overlook those issues more or less altogether. So let me, I hope I've set the table a bit with a view from Washington. And again, thank you to the organizers. It's a real pleasure to join you. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. That was, if I were to use normal language, I would say insightful and comprehensive. But if I were a little effusive, may I say superb and marvelous presentation. Thank you. We're all better informed because of that presentation. And logically, we now turn to Dr. Guo Zitang. He's the professor of international relations at the Shanghai University of International Business and Economics. He's also director, Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies, and of the Institute of International Strategy and Policy Analysis. Dr. Guo has been the Chinese government's delegate to the Indian Ocean Dialogue of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. He's also a member, Standing Committee of the Shanghai Association of International Studies and the Shanghai Association for American Studies. His publications include Interpreting the China Threat, which he co-authored, and One for All for One, Collective Security and International Order. Currently, Dr. Guo's main area of interest are the nexus of China's national development strategy and foreign policy, as well as South Asian security. He has an extensive and rich engagement with our region, and we're very thankful that Dr. Guo has spared time to be with us. Dr. Guo, you have the virtual mic. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my great honor to be here and to join this very high level and comprehensive talk on South Asia affairs. Really a critical moment for us to talk about China India, Pakistan, and regional security affairs. There's a lot of challenges that we have to deal, talk about it. I would like just to talk about, following the theme of the conference of the meeting is how we think about the stalemate and cooperation or even the war in terms of the future of South Asia. How many changes, even unchanged things, we have to follow. Just review a little bit about that from my point of view. It's just my personal view, and maybe some Chinese scholars share my view, but maybe some of them don't share. But it's my own. Let me first talk about the changes, particularly in the last 1 or 2 years, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Is a fundamental shift. Before that, even after that, we have to look at these kind of changes. The first one in South Asia, from my point of view, very important change is the Indian foreign policy. From the last year, from the summer of last year, in August, the Indian government, Modi government changed, revised the constitution of Article 370, that's to change the state call of Kashmir, and also it involves the territory disputes with China, is Ladakh, the recent disputes, particularly this year. So this is a provocative action, make China that think that India trying to change its the regional status quo, not only with China, but also with Pakistan, and it affects the regional peace in this region, from my point of view. So how China will have to deal with that? So this, I will talk about it later. So this is a big change that India takes this provocative action to change this South Asia situation for almost half a century. That's, particularly after the China's India war in 1962. That's after that, almost 50 years, that's the status quo. Even China, India will have, the border disputes for 30 years. There's no shooting even there in the last 50 years, almost 50 years. So it's a very, between China and India, still tranquility and peace. Both sides of the military forces remain status quo. But this is now the step from the US, from the Indian side, to change the status quo, make China to worry about that. From the Pakistan side, the same. I think because Pakistan is weaker than India, so Pakistan have to find even new kind of balanced way that's to counterbalance the Indian provocative military actions there. So this is first fundamental change that's make China, I think, worry about the situation changed, particularly the Indian Modi government, that is kind of understanding of strategic situation, along with the US President Trump's policy toward China. So this is a very, very important change. The second, I agree with the other speakers that, talk about the China, China-US foreign, related situation. The strategic competition between China and the USA is not only internationally, but also regionally. So the US, we talk about the hardliners, even the hawkish policymakers in the White House, or even from the state department, you can see the US from the last, I think 1 year, from the end of last year, I think more, after pandemic COVID-19 spread, the Trump policy toward China really go to extreme that people worry about the Cold War, the new Cold War between China and the USA. And people worry about decoupling of the economies, two economies. So this is a consensus, as just Professor Markey mentioned, that the common is a bipartisan agreement, a consensus in the White House, in the USA, that the US take China as strategic competitor. But from China's side, we also agree with that. But China regards this as more the US policy is toward the new containment foreign policy toward China. The Vice President Mike Pence, the Secretary of State Pompeo's speeches of China policy that takes the ideological confrontation, similar like the Soviet Union and the USA in the Cold War era. So this is not only just a kind of confrontation of interests, but also confrontation of values, even political system. But China disagree with that, actually. China cannot accept it. That is ideological confrontation, but China have to acknowledge, accept this should be a very, very big challenge from USA, that you have to deal with the biggest threat, if we say that, in South Asia, China Sea, or even East China Sea, the US military pressure over there. So China takes the USA as the, if you look at the bilateral actions from diplomatic actions to the military, to the economy, to the military, all the fields that is go to the confrontation of the Cold War, similar like that. So this is containment, new containment of foreign policy toward China from the White House. That makes the South Asia also changes of the mindsets of the regional security issues, particularly of the Indian side. So the Modi government take, from my perspective, many China agree with that. Many Chinese agree with that. The Indian governments are trying to use this kind of strategic opportunity. That's China's first priority is dealing with the USA, so the Indian side can take more provocative actions along the border that can take some gains from this game. So that's why it happens in this spring, particularly the casualties of the conflicts in June 15, Calavan Valley, the confrontations there. And this is bringing very grave consequences to the bilateral relation with China and the US and India. That's really harmful to this status quo. As I mentioned, trying to maintain the status quo, but very, very hard because the US foreign policy change to make the Indian side, I think that is a good opportunity for them. The third change, I think, is the economic side, because of in terms of this COVID-19 and its economic consequences. People, at the very early of this year, I remember I was in UK, I was in London. I remember it's late June. When I was there, I even talked with the British people, the scholars there. They don't believe this pandemic can spread to UK, to the European countries, to the USA. I think this more, they talk about this Asian virus. This Asian can only happens to the Asian people, not to Europeans. So I think this is when they when the COVID-19 spread to the European and the USA, they are astonishing. They were astonishing to know that they cannot accept it's a global pandemic. This is why the blaming of China, I don't want to talk about that, but I'm talking about this pandemic really hit these economies, world economies. Not only Chinese economy, but the US economy, European economy. Everyone knows that is really domestic pressures of the economic growth, employment rates, a lot of that. So this pandemic changed I think encouraged the changes of the international relations, make this great competition between China and India, China and USA, and this great power competition again more severe, more tense. So in terms of the Modi government in India, you can see, excuse me, the Modi government in April, in May, they're trying to take counter actions against COVID-19 in domestic affairs. But later, they found that China have to, step out of the COVID-19 shadow, and Chinese economy is recovering very quickly. The Indian side is, not the Indians actually, but also USA, Americans, Europeans worry about the Chinese economy might overwhelmingly dominate the economy because the China stepped out earlier from the COVID-19. So this makes the Indian side in terms of South Asia. So I think that the Indian have to open the economy very, very quickly, even they have the very serious pandemic domestically in India even now. So the Indian side takes these actions militarily, diplomatically. You can see the Indian side takes the takes the action of banning of Chinese APP, Chinese even restrict Chinese investments there, even a lot. It seems for China is unacceptable. That because it seems that the Indian side want to decoupling its economy with China. It's trying to learn that follow the American policy toward China. So this is a very complicated situation because it's kind of pandemics, COVID-19. The fourth change, I think I mentioned, I don't want to repeat more about that, is as people talk about just now, Professor, I think you mentioned, talk about the Afghanistan and other regional affair changes. China recently hosts a trilateral diplomatic dialogue between, among China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. So trying to seek a peaceful and stability in Afghanistan. And really, I think in the long-term run, I think this will be very helpful for the regional country to think about it. China and other countries can can play a very positive role to stabilize as a stabilizer in this region, economically and politically here. So let me next talk about some unchanged issues. Very quickly, there are 3 points I from my understanding is that even you can see the changes, particularly from the Indian side, because the Indian is #1 in South Asia, in the subcontinent. But Indian still, from my point of view, like some other South Asian countries, even including Pakistan and other smaller countries in South Asia, they didn't change their intention. I think their desire to develop the regional economy and their economic development unchanged. Even the Modi government wants a strong economy. Pakistan, of course, and China also wish to see economic growth region in South Asia. And China wants to also involve in this economic reintegration. That's because it's also helpful for China's economy. So this, I think, until now, there's no change. Still, that I think the regional orientation as of all the countries here. The second is Chinese foreign policy toward South Asia unchanged. Even we got very strong retaliation, if you say that, against Chinese economy from the Indian side because of the border disputes. China didn't really take kind of provocative or even counter measures against the Indian economy. China trying to wait, to take time, let the Indians calm down to think about what the first priority of Indian government, Indian people is not to fight a war with China, is to develop the economy. So I think Chinese foreign policy towards this region unchanged. China ways economic integration with this region. This is a very potential economic region. Because China can involve it not only the BRI initiative, but also China when involved even politically to stabilize, play this stabilizer in this region to help or to economically incorporate its side. The third, from my point of view, is Indian-Pakistan relations. It's still not actually the situation unchanged. For many years, the people really hope that India and Pakistan have a peaceful negotiation trying to solve the Kashmir disputes. But until now, we didn't see any future of that. Particularly, the Indians changed the status quo of Kashmir. So there's still the same situation. The Indians, I don't think the Indians, Modi government can change fundamentally toward the policy toward Pakistan. This is very sad, but it's a continuation of Indian policy toward Pakistan. However, this kind of isolation of, if you look at the Indian foreign policy toward Pakistan, is more isolate, trying to do more pressure over Pakistan internationally to isolate Pakistan in the past 4 years, even 5 years during the Modi government. However, it's negative consequences. Also, it's not really take, I don't think that is any useful since still you can see that Pakistan is still have more international support from Middle East, from China, even just mentioned the U.S. policy also during Trump administration not changed so quickly towards Pakistan. It's all because even in the counter terrorism situation there. So it's still unchanged there through this kind of regional and bilateral relationship among these regional and international actors there. And one more factor is there is Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it's even not going through so well in terms of the regional cooperation, because India and Pakistan don't want ICO to involve in these bilateral disputes. So I think, but it's very helpful for people to think about it. The other countries around this South Asian region, people wish or hope there should be a peaceful country, a peaceful region. Let me conclude my talk. It's China, and I agree with the former speakers that China don't want to fight a war with India. But Indian foreign policy really in the last several years changed this mindset of understanding of regional affairs and even international situation. So this foreign policy opportunism of Indian governments really, I think from last year, trying to change the status quo there in the race region, really, I think is based on the miscalculation of Chinese policy position over here. This is why now in South Asia, in the China-Indian border disputes, China takes all those very strong position. And after even the two foreign ministers of China and India meeting in Moscow several days ago, reached a 5-point consensus. But still, both sides still maintain the military forces there, and I think it takes time. But I don't think both sides want to work. Both sides are still now very restrained, self-restrained. I think it takes time. So I'm still, but I'm worrying about I just mentioned, just another professor mentioned, a miscalculation on this, kind of what would be very dangerous. I think that's why China and India now take a very high level dialogue of the regional bilateral border disputes. Or even I think in the future, China and India, even including the South, including Pakistan and even other smaller countries, I think should be involved with this regional peace process to talk about the regional, how to maintain the regional peace. Should be very helpful for the region, but also for every country in this region. I stop here. Thank you very much.
In fact, we should thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. That was an excellent presentation. Very complete analysis, and gives us very clearly China's position on many issues. And I'll ask the participants to, those who want to make a comment, to to go to the raise hands icon and click it before I go to the last speaker. And he's none other than Mr. Akar Patel. I'm very pleased to welcome him to this discussion. Mr. Patel is a syndicated columnist in India. His book are Hindu Rashtra, perhaps means land of faith, is on majoritarianism in South Asia. It is due to be released soon. He is also translated into English, Saadat Hasan Manto's non-fiction writings. Akar's columns and blogs are essential readings for understanding contemporary issues in India and the region, in fact. His weekly columns that appeared until recently in Pakistan's Express Tribune was something that I'd always looked forward to, and I know quite a few others who did too. Akar is a public intellectual. He raises issues of critical importance to his country. I'm sure this will be a specially informed discussion on the state of affairs in our region and how it may evolve. Thank you for joining us. Let's welcome Mr. Akar Patel.
And thank you for having me. I'll speak to the subject of cooperation and stalemate and ask what it is that India seeks, and start with what Manmohan Singh's foreign policy had been in the 10 years that he was in power. And he laid it out in 2013, just before leaving office. And the thrust of it was that India ought to engage the world as much as possible to the end that it was able to develop its economy. And the thinking broadly was that India had the talent, it had the capacity in some way to be able to develop itself, and it would help the country if it were able to engage not just the wider world, but the South Asia region as well. In the Manmohan Singh years, exports grew 500% in India. They reached about 350 billion US dollars a year. This is merchandise exports. Maybe it was also the time that you had global trade at a high, so it was the tide that lifted all boats. But it was the case that the stated intent that Manmohan Singh had was able to see itself through in strategy, and it did produce the sort of results that he had foreseen. When Mr. Modi took power in 2014, he had a manifesto which said that the Manmohan Singh government had, in fact, not done enough to be able to engage India's neighbors in South Asia. It says, the manifesto in 2014, that the UPA, that is the Manmohan Singh government, failed to establish enduring, friendly and cooperative relations with the neighbors. And it said that it would try and correct this. This is part of the 2014 manifesto. This doesn't find any reference in the 2019 manifesto. Mr. Modi, as we know, won a very handsome victory in 2019. The foreign policy that is reflected in 2014 is not to a large extent seen in 2019. Why is this the case? We don't know. There is no real articulation of why it is that Mr. Modi felt that the UPA government before him had failed in doing what it had tried to. And he did not really articulate what it was that he would do differently. There was no text other than the two lines in the manifesto that said that in 2014 that the NDA, Mr. Modi's government, would try and correct in some ways what it saw as the faults of the past. The phrase "neighborhood first" has been used by the BJP to define define a part of its foreign policy. What that means, again, we don't know. There is no specific articulation or text of this. But as I said, in 2019, this line fell off. There was a reference to SARC in 2014 in the manifesto that does not come up again in 2019. What happens in the period between 2014 and 2019 is that for a variety of reasons, India and India's relations with its neighbors actually deteriorate. And in part, that has to do with the policies within India, whereas the BJP has pursued a majoritarian thrust that has divided the country in many ways. And it has upset some of our neighbors as well. The best example of what Mr. Modi could have done is to replicate the open border that India has and has had with Nepal. We don't need visas to travel there. Goods, merchandise, services travel freely. To some extent, even that relation has been disturbed in the last 6 years. So we had a blockade inside Nepal 4 years ago, which was blamed by many Nepalese on the Modi government. And that damaged things to a fairly large extent. Those who had traveled to Nepal 2 or 3 years after the event could still sense that there was some hostility even in the Nepalese towards the Indians for this blockade, which meant essentially that essential supplies, including petroleum, gas, medicines, were not able to go from northern India into Nepal. With Bangladesh, we've had reasonably good ties over the last few decades. These seem to have deteriorated under Mr. Modi. There was a report, and once again, it's difficult to corroborate these things because there is a certain opacity with which the Modi government functions, which is unusual given the fact that we are a democratic nation. That the Bangladesh Prime Minister had not given an appointment to the ambassador from India for 4 months, and he was trying to meet her. And it is felt, and we can assume this to be true to a fairly large extent, that Bangladesh has been upset by the fact that India has pushed laws internally that have demonized, in some sense, Bangladesh. So we've had citizenship laws passed last year, which assume for the most part that in all of South Asia, it is only the Muslim majority nations that discriminate against their minorities, and it is only the non-Muslims who feel the brunt of this discrimination. So India specifically has identified Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh as being the three nations from whom it will accept non-Muslim refugees because, according to the law, these nations actively persecute the non-Muslims in their nations. So a lot of it seems to have not been fully thought through in terms of the reconciliation between what we do within the country and what the fallout will be with the larger neighborhood. But the result has been what we saw it to have been, that from a focus, from a thrust in 2014, where Mr. Modi said that he wanted to in fact become closer to the rest of South Asia than had been the case in the past, we seem to have drifted in large measure. I'll turn to Pakistan specifically and ask what it is that will shift the needle from stalemate to a cooperation. To know that, we ought to ask ourselves what it is that India seeks from Pakistan. So the background to this is that in the 90s, in the late 90s, it is Indian prime ministers who would reach out and ask for talks with Pakistan. This was Nawaz Sharif's second term. We had people like Gujral in office, Deve Gowda in office, and it would be Pakistan that would be reluctant in some ways to engage. Perhaps, and this is what was written in the papers here, that it was the pressure that was created by Pakistan's Kashmir policy, and that India, to try and get over it, wanted to engage Pakistan, which didn't feel at that time that it needed to. This shifted 10 years later, and it was Pakistan that was seen as trying to engage India. This didn't last too long and has remained so. Why we call it a stalemate is that there seems to be very little movement. There also seems to be not too much by way of what India wants, what it is that Pakistan wants, and what it is that the two countries can do to be able to set aside the differences and talk. The fact is that Kashmir has remained a dispute between them. We have a UNMOGIP office in Delhi, which the BJP tried to dismantle, but it could not. The UN, in whatever small fashion, is actually invested in this, not to any point of relevance, but it does exist in Delhi as a part of the UN Security Council resolutions. But what has happened in the last 20 years is that India has more or less got from Pakistan what it wanted, which is that it wanted violence in Jammu and Kashmir to go down. And the history of this is that the trajectory of violence begins, as we know, in the late 80s. Suddenly, in the year 1990, we have a lot of fatalities. We've got 1,000 in a fairly small state. So this is a state of which Kashmir has about 10 million in terms of population. And the graph goes up fairly quickly. So between 1990 and 2001, fatalities go from almost nothing in 1988 and 1989. They were about 100 or so. They go from 1,000 in 1990 to 4,000 dead in 2001 and 2. And a lot of this is the armed forces. A lot of this is civilians that have been caught in the violence. A lot of this is militants. What happens in 2001 at the end of the year is that the parliament in India is attacked. India says it is by a joint action from the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. India mobilizes its army on the Rajasthan front. A few weeks later, President Musharraf says that he will ban Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, and he does so. What happens after that is that violence in Jammu and Kashmir declines. And it declines quite sharply. In the same way that it went up in the last 10 years, it goes down in the next 10 years. So you've got fatalities at about 4,000, more than that in 2002, which keep dropping sharply every year till in 2011, I think it is. It goes down to under 200. So it's a 95% drop in the number of people that have died in Kashmir. And that decline slices through all the three categories of the dead. It's the armed forces, the security forces of this country, including the Jammu and Kashmir police. It is those who are killed and called militants, and it is civilians. This has not been acknowledged by India, which has been keen to blame Pakistan for the ratcheting up of the violence, but it doesn't seem to have an explanation for why the violence has been brought down. Parallelly, after President Musharraf's actions, which India says were not fully seen through, violence in Pakistan goes up. So from about 200 fatalities a year 20 years ago, at the point in time when 9/11 happens, fatalities tend to rise. They go higher than they did in Kashmir, and in 2009, Pakistan loses 11,000 lives. So this again is a mix of the armed forces, those who are called militants, and civilians. Since then, it has declined as well in Pakistan, and in the last 10 years, it's come down to about 300 a year or so, which is still a lot. But it is not anywhere near the levels of violence that the subcontinent has seen on this specific issue, either in Kashmir or in those parts of Pakistan that had a militancy in them. My point is that India has said that it will talk to Pakistan at the point in time when terrorism stops. We don't have any specific indicator of what that number is. The assumption here is that all violence in Jammu and Kashmir happens because of Pakistan. We know that that is not true. A large number of people who have died in Kashmir and have killed in Kashmir are locals, including Burhan Wani, the 21-year-old man who was killed in 2016 and whose death led to a lot of violence in Kashmir. So if there were clarity on what it is that India wanted in terms of action from Pakistan, which showed by way of numbers, it would be easier to be able to reach that point. Unfortunately, as I said, we don't have a stated policy from Mr. Modi on what terms he wants to engage South Asia and specifically Pakistan on. Do we have a neighborhood first policy? We have the words. What does the policy mean? To a large extent, and I've tried to find out as much as I can, the view is that there is no written document that sets out how it is that India will create neighborhood first. Having dropped SARC, even the reference of SARC from the 2019 manifesto, India turned to things like BIMSTEC and a joint group which has Bhutan and Bangladesh, from which called BBIN, from which Bhutan actually dropped out. So it's not as if moving on from SARC has helped India in some way formulate this neighborhood first policy. And if there are any contours to it, we've not seen them over the last 6 years. I'll try and bring in Pakistan at this stage. The Indian Army developed a two-front doctrine about a decade ago. And the assumption even then was that at some point the military would have to shift and would have to recognize the fact that it was China from where the primary threat to India came. That shift has not happened. So India's military over the last 6 years is dominated by the counterinsurgency doctrine. Both the chief of defense staff, General Rawat, and the chief of the army, General Naravane, they are counterinsurgency specialists. General Rawat had said a few months ago that he did not expect anything to happen on the China border because things had been sorted out under Mr. Modi. This, as we know, has turned out not to be true. But the shift that the army foresaw of trying to have a limited two-front war in some stage only for a brief period, and then acknowledge the fact that it would be China that would be the larger threat, and therefore you would have to make good or make peace in some way with Pakistan, has not come to be. We have not seen the transformation of that doctrine or that line into any sort of action that would tell us that the state in India is changing its dynamic from thinking about a two-front, a strategic threat, to trying and in some ways accommodate Pakistan so as to be able to focus on China. As I said, a large part of what India's relations with its neighbors have come to be in the last 6 years has been determined by things that India has chosen to do internally. And I think that it's not just limited to South Asia, but it's the larger world that has been attracted to what is going on in India in a way that it has not before. So in this year alone, we've got things like the European Union's members of parliament passing a motion against the citizenship bill that I spoke about. Late last year in December, the US House Foreign Affairs Committee raised Kashmir, and this was troublesome enough for India, for the foreign minister not to meet the committee because the woman who had moved the bill, Pramila Jayapal, was going to be part of the meeting, and he chose to duck the meeting rather than go and defend India and rather than go and defend this bill. The the UNHRHC has two separate reports on Kashmir in 2018 and in 2019 under two separate high commissioners. The first one, India had a problem with apparently because he was a Muslim. The second is Michelle Bachelet, and she has continued from where Zaid's report has gone on. And there are some fairly problematic things in Kashmir that the world has taken note of, including the use of 12-gauge shotguns, firing birdshot as crowd control weapons, laws that fundamentally have a different, that change the economy of Kashmir and make it separate from the rest of the country. So India is ranked 142 on the Media Freedom Index, and one reason is continual and persistent blackouts of the internet that have led the Kashmiri economy to be voided of the kind of new economy things that have come to the rest of India. The apps for that get you taxis and food and so on. None of that really exists in Srinagar. And so India has managed in some way in the last 6 years to be able to attract global attention to its issues in a way that it sought not to. And with that, it has also managed to aggravate some of its neighbors. My last point is on the question on China. So while we have a fairly nationalistic government, it's been silent on the happenings to a large extent silent on the happenings on the border in Ladakh. The Prime Minister claimed that there was no intrusion by the Chinese. The consensus in the media is that the line of actual control has shifted significantly, and areas that the army was able to patrol, there was a fairly large space that both the armies would patrol and not hold. Those areas, it seems, have been lost, and the army is no longer able to access them. Whether or not this constitutes a loss of territory, I don't know. Certainly, it is the case that Mr. Modi has said that it is not. Given that fact, it's been difficult for the media that is fairly easily distracted, but also for the nation to get behind the government. We don't know whether the problem really exists and to what level. And this is fairly unusual for what is a democratic society, because one would assume that in such a place where you are able to, where you put the numbers of your dead out in the open, you are able to mobilize public support on the basis of transparency, which to my mind, we have not seen. What is the larger plan that India has in terms of engagement with China? There again, we don't know. There is something called a Quad, of which we are a part, which doesn't have a standing force. Certainly doesn't have a land force that can be useful in places like Ladakh. For some reason, the BJP government seems to be insistent on aligning India with the Trump administration. There was a report yesterday which said that the overseas friends of the BJP in the US, there's a very large number of them, had registered as a foreign agent in support of President Trump. To what end, we don't know. It is a fact that with the rest of South Asia, more than 80% of those in the US who are from India, they tend to vote a Democrat. So why it is that we are trying to shift this vote and to what end is not really known. But the fact is that should Mr. Trump lose, a lot of the issues that some in India think that the rest of the world should take note of, including what is going on within India, will or might get picked up better under a democratic president than it would under Mr. Trump. Whether that is true or not, we will see. I will end there and hope that this has been useful.
Thank you, Akar Patel Saab. That was again a very complete analysis, but more than that, it was dispassionate and gave us a very clear idea of the triggers that can be used for negotiation. We'll open the discussion for questions, and before I do so, a couple of requests as usual that I will make. First of all, do use the raise hand icon. We're a little behind time, so I'm not quite sure if I can take too many questions. But if you scroll down to participants, you can find the raise hand icon. Some of you, of course, old friends and senior citizens like myself have texted me already. And so the first two questions will be from General Asad Durrani, and the next one will be from Mr. Tariq Ikram. General Asad Durrani sir, my request to everyone making comment or question is to please keep it short so that I can include as many as we can, but also that we will go back to the speakers to conclude their comments. General Asad Durrani sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. As far as the main theme is concerned, I don't think I have much to add after our common friend Anatol has made the three salient points. And I happen to agree with all three of them. Not much chance that the equation between India and Pakistan will improve. True, And one of the rare cases in which I would say it goes to India, not to us, because the deep state is very strong, stronger than any other country that I know, and it decided about 10, 15 years ago, keeping the status quo is in India's interest, it can manage it. It has more advantages, otherwise one does not know what would be the dynamics of change. So that is one reason why probably it's not likely to happen. I think in Afghanistan again, one of these things is for us in Pakistan rather important. Let's not take too much credit for this. Our only job was to bring the Taliban on the table. And for that, of course, one tried and one successfully did that. It kept our leverage with them. And that is the only way. Achievement in the sense that under great pressure we did. About the Chinese, I think this is the most important point nowadays. Let's not believe that the Chinese factor is going to resolve everything for us. We take out all our specialist fire. On Kashmir is right, we will not go beyond, but we know that. Having said that, if there is anything at all that I like to contribute in this discussion is about what another very important regional expert has said, Mr. Master. Now, once he declared victory in Afghanistan, I was reminded of two other declarations. One was after the withdrawal of the, or let's say after the withdrawal of Dunkirk, the British said, we have got our forces back, isn't it? Isn't it an achievement? One can agree with that. It was quite an achievement to getting its forces back. Another happened only recently in Vietnam. Modi, after Pulwama's debacle, said, yes, of course, Abhinandan is there, but I have told Imran that if he is not here within 24 hours, then we're going to be in for trouble. And it just so happened that that decision had already been taken because he so it helped him, he declared victory, and he got I don't think that was the reason why we got more majority in the next second round, the second election than it. But it was, another example of how you can turn around a setback into some benefit. Of Afghanistan, well, let me not go deep into it. The fact that it was very clear. Obama tried, so many other people tried to get out of this mess because it was not going to. You can come up with any number of arguments here because of terror, because of democracy in Afghanistan. Whether it was because of Central Asian resources or water, because to create chaos here, except for the last one. Afghanistan was not serving anywhere. Yes, by staying there, it ensured that the region, Afghanistan, Iran, it remained in some sort of a travail. So there it succeeded very well. And if it has gone, if Trump found the courage to defy his own deep state and taking the troops out, we are not completely out, but if he has done that, let me say that he's done one better than Obama, who wanted to do the same, but couldn't do it because the wrong party, the wrong color, and the wrong middle name and so on. Mr. Markey, all that I can say is that I remember when you had the courage to say on Pakistani soil many years ago that you were paying money to Pakistan to change its behavior, and it requires some courage, except that it was not going to happen. We should know, as an expert, that Pakistan is not a state which takes money and would do the bidding. Like the Taliban would take more money than you and will still keep on fighting. So Pakistanis did whatever was in Pakistani interest, not its behavior. A question, if at all, I have to ask is to Akhir Patel. He once told us that the Pakistanis had less number of Punjabis and more Gujaratis, it would be good for us because the Punjabis do not know how to manage peace, and the Gujaratis, because of their sense of business, can always do better. I tended to agree with that, but now I must ask him, after you got the great Gujarati at the helm of affairs, are you still of the same opinion or have you changed?
Yeah, you certainly got him there. That's for sure. Are you done, sir? Go ahead. Okay. With your permission, I'll go to Tariq Ikram, sir.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. I'm humbled amongst such immense audience and some former colleagues like Khurshid Saab and Mai Akhtar Saab and so on and so forth. I'd just like to make a comment which might attract a comment from the August panel, but I'd like to take it from a different perspective, the situation in South Asia. Socio-economically and even politically, the center of gravity is known to be shifting to South Asia and the surrounding areas. So it is in that context that I'm going to take a different view of our discussion today. I have great regards and respect for planners both in Pakistan and in India, and of course in China. So therefore, I venture to say that given the planning in each of these countries, I forget the name of the speaker who just said that one of the most significant events is the change of the constitution that India has made and the impact that it is having regionally and internationally. I was thinking that the planners in India must be thinking that they are now at the verge of a breakthrough, socio-economic, political breakthrough. And when you are trying to make a breakthrough, you start to fire your engines so that you can break through the stratosphere. And I was thinking that could it be that this action of India of amending its constitution and making such a significant change, which cannot be without a recognition of the implications of all that, has been made to test 3 or 4 things. One is, what would be the reaction of the world? How will the world react? How will United Nations react? How will the world bodies react? Secondly, that it's probably testing India's own socio-economic and political strengths. After all, their foreign office, their economic planners have not been sitting idle. They've worked towards developing the economy, etc., etc. And in the context of the breakthrough that I'm talking about, they're wanting to test its economic, political strengths. And the third thing that they might be wanting to test is that what is the level of interest that the US have in Pakistan, and how would that get balanced when the push comes to a shove?
Okay, good.
Finally, what
all
would
right.
be the test of Pakistan-China relationship? So I thought that maybe this is a strategic way of being able to test out to be able to start to making a breakthrough. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tariq Ikram. He was State Minister for Commerce and the head of our Export Promotion, Trade Development Authority. Dr. Guo will have to leave because it's almost 11 o'clock in Shanghai. He will leave at 11 o'clock his time, which is in another 10 minutes or so. So I'll take a couple of very quick questions. Iram Khalid Sattar and then Ismail Qureshi.
Great. Thank you so much. Actually, this is a question to Professor Levin. Professor Levin, what I'm interested in is to get your thoughts in a geostrategic perspective on what the investments from China vis-a-vis dam building in Pakistan do, because obviously, as we know, Pakistan has massive acute water shortages. This is a way now where China has moved in as a funder, for infrastructure construction. So how does it change the geopolitics? And if you can also give us your thoughts on how that would affect affect sort of internal, very protracted, contested water relations within Pakistan? So very specifically, if you could give me your thoughts on that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Sattar teaches at Tufts University in Massachusetts. She teaches sustainable development. I think I'm slightly wrong there, but not too much. Ismail Qureshi.
Okay, sir. I think we've had a very good discussion. I'm just looking at this entire region, and we have lots of challenges and risks. To name a few: COVID, climate change, governance, jobs, economic transformation, conflict, gender, majoritarianism. I was just wondering that what I heard from the speakers, things don't look very promising, unfortunately, in South Asia. So is it right to understand that on top of where we stand and the challenges and risks that we have, the policy space will be now further be increasingly influenced by the external powers and will further deter the achievement of the lasting development impacts for the South Asia's future? I thought I'll be asking Mr. Anatol and Akhil Patel.
Good. Thank you, Ismail. As always, very good question. Syed Rizvi.
It's a great pleasure once again to be here with you.
Very brief, please. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if Dr. Guam, has he gone or is he there?
He's here.
Okay. This question is for Dr. Tang, and I didn't hear anything today about how much importance China attaches to CPEC, which Pakistan is talking about China-Pakistan economic corridor, and is the extension of the China's strategic interest to the Middle East, water, to sea. And the second thing is that, he says that we should be keeping the situation under control in the border, but there's a massive buildup of the Indian forces on the other side as well, the Chinese. And another question on which it will maybe the other two, Professor Anatol and Professor Daniel could comment on that. That is, if China does not, they say there's not likely to be a major conflict, and China doesn't want it, why is Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, and other parts of Ladakh are shown as a part of the Chinese territory?
All right, good, Rizvi, and thank you for being brief. Dr. Rizvi teaches at one of the American universities in the UAE. The last question, I'm sorry I can't take everyone, but Ubaid Patel.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to ask my question. I'll try and keep it brief. How important is the CPEC, the Belt and Road Initiative, in this entire debate or in this entire spectrum, in the sense that perhaps peace, stalemate, or war between India and Pakistan is going to be, directly proportional with time, in the sense that the more progressive the CPEC becomes, and the closer that we reach towards economic prosperity in Pakistan, perhaps this environment of war or the Indian aggression could be subsided a little, because China and Pakistan, together with economic might ensure that the war, that the potential of war might subside. So is it really time bound? Is CPEC going to be the big variable? I'd like any of the panelists to take this.
Good. Thank you. Could we go first to Dr. Guo, if he's still here? Could you, Dr. Guo?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much for your understandings, for your kindness. It's already had a class in the evening, so it's a little tired. It's almost 11 p.m. in Shanghai. Thank you for the question. In terms, I would like to answer both sides, both questions together about CPEC and China, India. economically particularly. As I mentioned in my remarks, as the Indian, I didn't talk too much in my remarks just now. I mentioned, but here I would like to elaborate that Indian government now trying, from the last several months is retaliation against the Chinese products, against the Chinese APP, against the Chinese investment. A lot of actions that's make China worry about that. India is trying to decoupling its economy with China or not. There are uncertainties here. One, I think you mentioned, is the U.S. presidential election might affect the Modi government choices toward China. So this is one aspect, one of the aspects. So another is how the Indian government toward, the policy toward the regional economic integration. One is a side of his policies, how India will take its policy toward Pakistan is trying to similar same as before to isolate Pakistan from the international community or from the regional economic integration. The second is trying to decoupling the economy with China. So in terms of these two aspects of its tendencies or uncertainties, so when it comes to CPEC, so if the U.S., if the Indian government trying to do, doing more further, I think both sides, China and Pakistan, have to take this CPEC more broadly view. Think about that. Because really the Indian policy might stop this regional economic integration regionally in South Asia. So it depends how Indian government actions, responses to China, to Pakistan, and they also policy towards is a long-term policy toward China. It's trying to isolate or decoupling Chinese economy from the South Asian countries. That will be a big problem. So I think China and Pakistan, the CPEC programs will carry forward. It depends on more that Indian policy, any changes in the near future. Another is, I remember just one question about the Guada port. I think all these CPEC programs, I think from a Chinese perspective, is without no intention of to contain India, but to develop the China and Pakistan economic cooperation, and also will be helpful to encourage the regional economic integration in this region. But Indian, this mindset of confrontation for long term actually might change geopolitically in this region. I think we have the time to see that. I stop here. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Guo. I know that you've earned your rest, and it's already.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to on the offline, and I wish everybody have a good health and promising future. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you again. We've unmuted Recitation, former foreign minister, and Riaz Khan, former foreign secretary. If I'll ask, indulge the other I'll ask for their indulgence, please, with me. If they have to make a comment, please go ahead. Khurshid Kasuri Saab, yeah, Riaz Mohammed Khan Saab. Otherwise, we'll go.
I was relaxing and listening to very useful talks, and I thought that would be the end of it. But anyway, it's a pleasure. I'd like to, apart from the Pakistan-India thing, I'd like to just make one comment on Pakistan-India, and then I have brief questions, basically. On Pakistan-India, my own impression is that currently it's not we're not likely to make much headway in our dialogue with India. But I also believe, as Mr. Tariq Aziz had stated in his opening remarks, that we have very little option. I won't take your time, there are many reasons for that. So dialogue will probably have to continue, but Mr. Modi may not find it either feasible or convenient because it doesn't suit his local politics. And but whatever we have worked out during our tenure, which I have listed in the book, given all the details, I cannot think of any other solution because we fought wars in the past. 5 times we were near a war situation, 5 times we fought wars, the last being at Kargil, and it really yielded nothing. The only positive development during the 70 years was the talks during our tenure, which succeeded even in producing, more or less producing a blueprint, a possible solution of Jammu and Kashmir. Mr. Tariq Aziz rightly referred to the reasons why it did not come to fruition. It was Pakistan's domestic politics, and of course there were other factors. So there will be people in India, and I know everybody in India doesn't think like Prime Minister Modi. Mr. Patel is one of those, and there are many others that I know. And in fact, even in the last elections, Mr. Modi, first in the 2014 elections, he had, I think, 31% of the vote, and in the last election, he had 36% of the vote. It's really a failure of the opposition to get together, and now he may seem like an existential threat to a large number of political parties, and maybe things may be different. And then after the failure of the Indian economy, the way coronavirus is being handled in India, it may give greater strength to Mr. Modi's domestic critics. And one of the offshoots may be some sort of a change in government 2, 3, 4 years down the road. So I think we have no option but to resume a dialogue, but I don't see it being resumed in a hurry. Now, specifically coming to 2 questions. One is to Mr. Markey and one to Mr. Akar Patel. The one to Mr. Markey is that if Mr. Biden were to become President of the United States, what is the impact on Prime Minister Modi's policies, which are anything but democratic, within the Indian polity, the gross human rights violations? Will it turn a blind eye, or will there be something pushing India in the right direction, maybe behind the scenes? Mr. Akar Patel, I have seen many Indian writers recently talk of the need to talk to Pakistan because of recent happenings on the border with China. I don't want to take more of your time. I'd like comments on these, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us and for those good comments. I think Dan may have left, but if Anatole can cover for him, if that's possible. Secretary Riaz Saab, and then we'll go back to the speakers.
Thank you very much, Ashraf Hayat Saab. It was a very useful discussion. I have a short comment, although I wanted to basically listen to this debate. My comment is that we did come very close to addressing some of the issues between Pakistan and India. And my view has always been that it's not just the good intentions which count, but also you have to have some practical steps, practical achievements. So whether it's Sir Creek, whether it's Siachen, or whether it's Kashmir, you have to have some thing to clinch so that there is a breakthrough between Pakistan and India in terms of normalization and better relationship. I have great respect for Tariq Aziz Saab, who had carried forward this effort in 2005-2006. Unfortunately, the 2007 judicial crisis interrupted the process, and later on it really could not take off. I think it requires a great deal of courage on the part of the leadership in both the countries to be able to address these issues. And I had written in March in one of the papers that these are issues which could turn from areas of conflict into areas, arenas of cooperation between the two countries, and really set new precedents for opportunities in South Asia. Anyway, somehow the hardline positions, they prevail, and they are prevailing these days. It's my view that it is always easy to retreat into hardline positions, but they prolong the problems and misery. My question would be to Professor Markey, if he's there. There is a sentiment in the United States that in order to contain China, which they think is necessary in this competition, there is a need for some kind of a kinetic action, some kind of a military confrontation. How serious you think is this view? And how serious is the possibility that there would be, there could be a military confrontation? I had once opportunity to discuss it with Professor Anatole Levin, and he was more concerned about the possibility of some accident, that there can be an accidental conflict between the two sides. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Riaz bhai. You know, I was saying to Dr. Guo that it's time for him to rest. I guess it's time for me to rest. I'm not quite sure why I thought that Daniel Markey has left when he's very much there. I apologize, Dan. So let's go back to the speakers. We'll go Anatole, Daniel Markey, Akar Patel, and if Tariq Saab is still there, please. So Anatole, and then Daniel Markey, and then Akar Patel.
Thank you. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Though I would first of all like to congratulate Mr. Kasuri on also on his tremendous work for a resolution of the Kashmir conflict. You know, that effort was more hopeful than any other in the entire history of the dispute. It's a tragedy that it failed. On the question of whether CPEC can make a big difference to Indo-Pakistan relations, in the very long run, one should never rule anything out. You know, my God, you know, just in this past 6 months, we've seen how things, completely unexpected things, can make a huge difference to international relations. But all other things being equal, I do not expect that for a long time to come. Where I think CPEC could potentially make a big difference is in Pakistan-Afghan relations. If it gives real new economic opportunities to Afghanistan through connections with Pakistan. But of course that depends in the end on a conflict within Afghanistan, about which I've already said I am not hopeful. The other area where CPEC would make a very big difference is in Pakistan's relations with Iran, because we have seen, albeit as yet only on paper, a Chinese paper commitment to huge investment in Iran, a quite new level of Chinese engagement with the Middle East, and of course of great importance in the context of US-Chinese relations as well. Now, of course, from that point of view, a great asset of CPEC to the Chinese is if it could be extended through Pakistan into Iran. But as we know, that would require some quite hard choices for Pakistan, especially when it comes to the relationship with Saudi Arabia. But nonetheless, I would see this as a building block of greater regional stability if it could be achieved. On the wider implications of CPEC for Pakistan, oh, actually, just before I come to that, one thing, there was a question about China and Arunachal Pradesh. If China had wanted Arunachal Pradesh, it could have taken it in 1962. There was nothing to stop it militarily. My sense of Chinese policy, it's a pity that Professor Guo isn't here to correct me, is two things. One is, militarily speaking, they don't want to advance from the mountains into the plains. At the moment, they are in a strategically superior or tactically superior position. They don't want to give that up. But the second thing is that keeping the territorial claim to Arunachal alive allows China to pull India's chain, to take a dig at India whenever other Chinese interests or when Indian action in other areas gives China a reason to do this. Once again, for example, Indian action in the South China Sea. But I don't think it would be wise to rely on the idea that China is really committed to taking Arunachal Pradesh. I don't think that it is. I don't think that it wants to resolve the dispute either. On the implications of CPEC for Pakistan, well, apart from the key question for Pakistan is this just going to be a Chinese corridor to the Middle East, either to the sea at Gwadar or through Pakistan to Iran? Or is this, or are the things that are going to accompany, or were promised to accompany, CPEC going to make a huge difference to the Pakistani economy and society? And, sorry, pause for a brief advertisement. I've just published a book, oh, it's upside down, and it's also back to front. It's called Climate Change and the Nation State, came out this year, updated edition coming out next year. And the whole section of that is on the question of water and water shortages in South Asia in the context of climate change. But as we know, even without climate change, this is a huge issue. And for me, an existential issue in the long run for Pakistan and indeed the whole region, given the level of water stress that already exists. Now, both because China itself suffers from really serious problems when it comes to water, but also because in consequence, China has developed really impressive new approaches and new technologies. China has an enormous amount to offer Pakistan there. But once again, Pakistan needs to undertake the reforms and the efforts which will allow it to use that assistance. And frankly, will also motivate the Chinese to give more assistance. Because I think as the whole of international experience shows, only part of this can come down from the state. If you look at the Green Revolution in Pakistan and elsewhere in the world, that only worked because there was a real interaction with the desire and the ability of farmers to change things from below. And the question is whether Pakistan can motivate its agricultural sector to do this. If it can, I think the Chinese will be there to help. So I would really, really emphasize this as an issue. In the end, leaving aside all the other issues that we talked about, Kashmir, security, without water, without sufficient water for a population of 400 million people, Pakistan will not survive the next century. On other questions of CPEC, well, the biggest one is, of course, electricity generation. I mean, there are many others as well, railways and so forth. And, of course, there have been, I'm very sorry to say, an increasing number of disputes and controversies over this. Now, I don't want to allot blame for this. No doubt there is blame on both sides, Pakistani and Chinese. But I would just like to say that, every Pakistani government, every Pakistani government for the past 2 generations, 40 years, certainly ever since I've been coming to Pakistan, has failed to adequately to address this issue of electricity generation. And in the end, however much help comes from China, this is something that only Pakistan can address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Levin. On CPEC, our institute has done enough work, and Mahisa, myself included, we've been advocating for reform and domestic policies to benefit from CPEC. Dr. Daniel Markey, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for this great conversation. I've enjoyed all of it. Let me pick up on a few pieces here, but briefly, just to kind of pick up on the CPEC conversation, because I think that's so important, and that really has been the core issue of significance and change in Pakistan's relations in the region. And if we don't focus on that, I think we're missing a lot. But I think one of the questions really led in this interesting way toward a longer term sense that the developmental benefits of CPEC could outweigh the political or geopolitical perturbations of China's increasing role in Pakistan. And that may be, as Anatole pointed out, all things are possible in the fullness of time. But for now, I think in my own research, I've tended to focus on those perturbations, the complications associated with an increasing Chinese role within Pakistan, and the pushback, some political, some at a security level, that we have seen as a consequence of that. And I think even more, the complicating factor of an increasing Chinese support to Pakistan, what India's response to that has been, what Pakistan's response to that has been, and the potential for escalation there. I think we're already seeing this. And so these worrying elements or worrisome elements are in the short run more material than that potential benefit over the longer term. A different observation with regard to China and India. One thing that I think is certainly because I'm sitting here in the DC area, I think it's very important to point out a stark difference of assessment about what is actually going on here. And if I can simply, without reflecting on what the objective truth is, share with you what the consensus analysis here in Washington is that rather than India being the opportunistic party here along its border with China, China is being seen as the opportunistic party, tactically, if not strategically, and India being the party that is responding to this. And so the way that our Chinese participant characterized this as India taking advantage of the potentially trying to take advantage of a COVID-19 moment to push China is almost the flip side or reverse of how most, if not all, American analysts are seeing that unfolding right now. And so as a consequence, or maybe because of the deeper American strategic sympathy for India and desire to work with India, particularly with respect to China, this is seen as a conflict in which the United States really needs to, if anything, quietly back India and make sure that India isn't forced to back down too much in the face of what is, again, perceived as Chinese aggression. Regardless of which side is actually right in terms of its analysis, I think that divergence of viewpoints is important to recognize because it frames very much how the reactions from Washington or Beijing might be quite different. I apologize I wasn't able to hear very well the question from General Durrani, but I would only, I think he was saying, are really seeing the end of American involvement in Afghanistan. And I would only say, yes, more than any time that we've seen in the last near 20 years, absolutely. And the difference in terms of perspective of what type of footprint we may leave behind now over the next few years is so starkly different from what we saw 5 or 7 years ago that in itself is meaningful. Quick responses to the other questions. How serious is a military action between the United States and China? The answer is, unfortunately, more serious than anyone would want to believe. And if you were to try to focus on where that might happen, it's over Taiwan, which has been a flashpoint historically, of course. And the concern right now is coming back to American perspectives on China. If we do see China behaving, in our terms, opportunistically in instances like Hong Kong, The fear is that this moment at which China has responded to the global pandemic more effectively than many others, and most other countries in the world are distracted by it, might it try to take advantage of that in Taiwan to push the envelope there? This is being written about in a very serious way, and relatively centrist analysts are saying that the United States needs to be more clear about its willingness to come to Taiwan's defense than it has been in the past, precisely because of the concern that China may overreach there. Last question on Biden's impact on India policy. Yes, I agree with the question basically that the Biden administration will have a tougher game to play on India, because I believe the Biden administration would actually care about India's human rights record within India and in Kashmir, and would push that agenda, but principally behind the scenes and quietly, because it would be always weighing that agenda against this other strategic desire to see India as a partner in countering or balancing China, and would want to preserve that. Simultaneously, I think Biden administration, by pursuing global initiatives like this democracy summit, would be putting India, would be in a sense grouping India, would be placing some external pressures on India, would not be doing this alone, but would be inviting India to participate in such a summit, but also raising tough questions about things like the CAA or Indian policies in Kashmir. Those things would likely come up in that context. And India would be on the spot in ways that it certainly hasn't been during the Trump administration. Thanks again for allowing me to participate in this. It's wonderful to have been able to see all of you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Akar Patel.
Thanks. So I'll go in reverse order with Mr. Kasuri's question first. The stated intent of the Modi government has been to become closer to its South Asian neighbors. So we must assume from that point that it seeks to reach out to Pakistan in some way and try and undo this 2009 doctrine that speaks of a two-front war. It is a military doctrine. It was not a doctrine that was owned by the political establishment. I think that it is important that a democracy's leadership own the national security policy, which to my mind has not happened in this particular instance. India has no strategic threat from Pakistan, and India's stated intent, according to Mr. Modi's 2014 manifesto, is to go closer to all of its South Asian neighbors. So it stands to reason that the 2009 military doctrine must be undone in some way, and that India should find some sort of peace with Pakistan and cooperate on all the issues on both sides that trouble the two nations. I'll say here that that there are other reasons that India needs to do this. As was said before, India feels, in my opinion, rightly so, that it has not actually aggravated what is going on in Ladakh today. Mr. Modi has met Mr. Xi 18 times. He's called him over to India. He's a great believer in personalized one-on-one bonds, which seem not to have worked in this instance. The foreign minister of India was quoted as saying last week that he didn't know why it was that the Chinese had stopped India from patrolling in those neutral areas in Ladakh. We don't even know why it is that the Chinese have done what they have. I think it's important for India to be able to set to rest at least one of the two fronts that it finds in some ways active at this point. And it stands to reason that even if there is some element of animosity towards Pakistan from the BJP, it is in the national interest to develop a national security doctrine that is able to best look at how it is that India can counter the real threats that it faces on the border. Whatever India has tried in terms of trying to outflank Pakistan has not really worked. The Chabahar port, India has lost it to China. A lot of years' work went into that. That has come to nothing. I think that in the absence of a strategic threat from Pakistan, it is vital that India, in some ways, act to set to rest the disputes with that country. To the question on external influence on India increasing in this period, I am afraid that that might not actually be the case. In my opinion, it is good that the rest of the world take a look at some of the policies that are unfolding in India against its own citizens. And there is nothing wrong with a democracy being open to a criticism from the outside. However, I think that the levers that are actually available from the outside have reduced in this period. I spoke about how exports had grown a 500% between 2004 and 2014. What I didn't say is that since 2014 they've been flat. So we've got exactly the same volume of merchandise exports to the rest of the world that we have in 2014 as we do now in 2020. It's reducing each month. So we are in a lower state now in terms of trade than we were 6 years ago. India's economy has shrunk significantly in the first quarter of the financial year, which for us is April, May, and June. It's down by about a quarter over the last year. And I fear that to a large extent that will mean that what the external world can do in terms of trying to influence India in terms of trade or otherwise will actually reduce. China is our second largest partner in trade. The volume of trade is shrinking quite quickly. And it is shrinking in a way that is not really explained. We are in a trade war seemingly with China where the other side is not reacting in trade terms. So we've got bans on apps, as was said earlier. We've got a stealth ban on foreign direct investment from China, but it's not stated. I think it would be good for India to clarify what it is that it seeks out of its trade relationship with China and to act on it firmly if need be. I think that India has a fairly nationalist population that is able to absorb loss in many ways, and whether that is good or bad, it does not hold the government back from taking firm action. I think what is missing at the moment is clarity. We don't really have a sense of what it is that's going on the borders, and we don't really have a sense of what it is that the government is doing in terms of pushing back. Lastly, to my friend Mr. Durrani, I will defend myself by saying that I'm only echoing the words of my Piro Murshid, Khalid Ahmed, who has said for a long time that it would have been better for the subcontinent if Gujaratis like Mr. Jinnah and Mr. Gandhi would have been in charge of Pakistan and of India. But the Gujarati population also includes myself and Mr. Modi. So maybe that's not such a wise thing after all. Thank you.
Thank you, Akbar. Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'll request Mr. Humayun Akhtar Khan, chairman of our institute, to close this excellent meeting, and I must thank all the speakers.
Let me say it has been once again the most interesting dialogue this evening in Pakistan. I know it's morning in the United States. I thoroughly enjoyed. One thing I was taken a bit by surprise by Dr. Markey, that one of the first things that Mr. Biden gets elected is to have a conference on democracy, whereas after President Obama's two terms, and certainly President Trump's term, we could see that the United States was moving away from the about a century-old Wilson doctrine, which President Wilson, about 100 years ago, conceived and subsequent to that, many U.S. presidents pursued. But let's see who wins the election and what happens. A good objective, though, promoting democracy in the world. And yes, I should also acknowledge Mr. Tariq Aziz, Mr. Khurshid Kasuri, and the whole team that was involved in the mid-2000s in negotiating a deal with India. Mr. Riaz Mahmud Khan was part of it. And all I can say is we were so close, and about 15 or so odd years later, we're still so far. We at IPR cherish our independent and non-partisanship, and we focus on instead on scholarship and practical solutions towards our goals, which are quite simple. It's the stability and prosperity of Pakistan and our pursuit towards global peace and security. And let me thank the speakers tonight for finding the time. Mr. Tariq Aziz, Dr. Anatol Levin, Dr. Markey, Dr. Go, and Mr. Akar Patel. We will continue these discussions. As I said, it's not going to be the first one, and I hope that you'll be able to participate in IPR's discussion once again. So, and of course, last but not the least, I want to thank the participants, the people who join our webinar, who are as important as the speakers. But unfortunately, we can just have 4 or 5. And many of these participants have been speakers in past IPR events. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. And let's end this meeting, and thank you very much, the speakers. Be generous with your time. Bye.